Section 15 of L'Assommoir. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Lazarus. L'Assommoir by Emile Zola. Translated by Ernest Davis Telly. Second part of Chapter 4. "Keep quiet," cried the midwife. "If only she could stop her from wearing herself out," said Coupeau with his mouth full. "If you were not here, I bet she'd get up and cut my bread. Now keep on your back, you big goose. You mustn't move about, otherwise it'll be a fortnight before you'll be able to stand on your legs. Your stew's very good, madam. Will you eat some with me, or won't you, madam?" The midwife declined, but she was willing to accept a glass of wine, because it had upset her, said she, to find the poor woman with the baby on the mat. Coupeau at length went off to tell the news to his relations. Half an hour later he returned with all of them, Mother Coupeau, the Lorilleux, and Madame Lerat, whom he had met at the latter's. "I brought you the whole gang," cried Coupeau. "It can't be helped. They wanted to see you. Now don't open your mouth. It's forbidden. They'll stop here and look at you without ceremony, you know. As for me, I'm going to make them some coffee, and of the right sort." He disappeared into the kitchen. Mother Coupeau, after kissing Gervaise, became amazed at the child's size. The other two women also kissed the invalid on her cheeks, and all three, standing before the bed, commented with diverse exclamations on the details of the confinement, a most remarkable confinement, just like having a tooth pulled, nothing more. Madame Lerat examined the baby all over, declared she was well formed, even added that she could grow up into an attractive woman. Noticing that the head had been squeezed into a point on top, she kneaded it gently, despite the infant's cries, trying to round it a bit. Madame Lorilleux grabbed the baby from her. That could be enough to give the poor little thing all sorts of vicious tendencies, meddling with it like that while her skull was still soft. Then she tried to figure out who the baby resembled. This almost led to a quarrel. Lorilleux, peering over the woman's shoulders, insisted that the little girl didn't look the least bit like Coupeau. Well, maybe a little around the nose, nothing more. She was her mother all over again, with big eyes like hers. Certainly there were no eyes like that in the Coupeau family. Coupeau, however, had failed to reappear. One could hear him in the kitchen, struggling with the grate and the coffee pot. Gervaise was worrying herself frightfully. It was not the proper thing for a man to make coffee, and she called and told him what to do, without listening to the midwife's energetic hush. "Here we are," said Coupeau, entering with the coffee pot in his hand. "Oh, didn't I just have a bother with it? It all went wrong on purpose. Now we'll drink out of glasses, won't we? Because, you know, the cups are still at the shop." They seated themselves around the table, and the zinc worker insisted on pouring out the coffee himself. It smelled very strong. It was none of that weak stuff. When the midwife had sipped hers up, she went off. Everything was going on nicely. She was not required. If the young woman did not pass a good night, they were to send for her on the morrow. She was scarcely down the staircase when Madame Lorilleux called her a glutton and a good-for-nothing. She put 4 lumps of sugar in her coffee and charged 15 francs for leaving you with a baby all by yourself. But Coupeau took her part. He would willingly fork out the 15 francs. After all, those sort of women spend their youth in studying. They were right to charge a good price. It was then Lorilleux who got into a quarrel with Madame Lerat by maintaining that in order to have a son, the head of the bed should be turned to the north. She shrugged her shoulders at such nonsense, offering another formula, which consisted in hiding under the mattress, without letting your wife know, a handful of fresh nettles picked in bright sunlight. The table had been pushed over close to the bed. Until 10 o'clock Gervaise lay there, smiling, although she was only half awake. She was becoming more and more weary. Her head turned sideways on the pillow. She no longer had the energy to venture a remark or a gesture. It seemed to her that she was dead, a very sweet death, from the depths of which she was happy to observe the others still in the land of the living. The thin cries of her baby daughter rose above the hum of heavy voices that were discussing a recent murder on Rue du Bon-Puits at the other end of La Chapelle. Then, as the visitors were thinking of leaving, they spoke of the christening. The Lorilleux had promised to be godfather and godmother. They looked very glum over the matter. However, if they had not been asked to stand, they would have felt rather peculiar. Coupeau did not see any need for christening the little one. It certainly would not procure her an income of 10,000 francs, and besides, she might catch a cold from it. The less one had to do with priests, the better. But Mother Coupeau called him a heathen. The Lorilleux, without going and eating consecrated bread in church, plumed themselves on their religious sentiments. "It shall be next Sunday, if you like," said the chainmaker. And Gervaise having consented by a nod, everyone kissed her and told her to take good care of herself. They also wished the baby goodbye. Each one went and leant over the little trembling body with smiles and loving words, as though she were able to understand. They called her Nana, the pet name for Anna, which was her godmother's name. "Good night, Nana. Come be a good girl, Nana." When they had at length gone off, Coupeau drew his chair close up to the bed and finished his pipe, holding Gervaise's hand in his. He smoked slowly, deeply affected, and uttering sentences between the puffs. "Well, old woman, they've made your head ache, haven't they? You see, I couldn't prevent them coming. After all, it shows their friendship. But we're alone, aren't we? I wanted to be alone like this with you. It has seemed such a long evening to me. Oh, poor little thing, she's had a lot to go through. Those shrimps, when they come out into the world, have no idea of the pain they cause. Why, it must really almost be like being split in two. Where does it hurt the most, that I may kiss it and make it well?" He had carefully slid one of his big hands under her back, and now he drew her towards him, bending over to kiss her stomach through the covers. Touched by a rough man's compassion for the suffering of a woman in childbirth, he inquired if he was hurting her. Gervaise felt very happy, and answered him that it didn't hurt any more at all. She was only worried about getting up as soon as possible, because there was no time to lie about. He assured her that he'd be responsible for earning the money for the new little one. He would be a real bum if he abandoned her and the little rascal. The way he figured it, what really counted was bringing her up properly. Wasn't that so? Coupeau did not sleep much that night. He covered up the fire in the stove. Every hour he had to get up to give the baby spoonfuls of lukewarm sugar and water. That did not prevent his going off to work in the morning as usual. He even took advantage of his lunch hour to make a declaration of the birth at the mayor's. During this time, Madame Boche, who had been informed of the event, had hastened to go and pass the day with Gervaise. But the latter, after 10 hours of sleep, bewailed her position, saying that she already felt pains all over her through having been so long in bed. She would become quite ill if they did not let her get up. In the evening, when Coupeau returned home, she told him all her worries. No doubt she had confidence in Madame Boche, only it put her beside herself to see a stranger installed in her room, opening the drawers and touching her things. On the morrow, the concierge, on returning from some errands, found her up, dressed, sweeping, and getting her husband's dinner ready, and it was impossible to persuade her to go to bed again. They were trying to make a fool of her, perhaps. It was all very well for ladies to pretend to be unable to move. When one was not rich, one had no time for that sort of thing. 3 days after her confinement, she was ironing petticoats at Madame Fauconnier's, banging her irons, and all in a perspiration from the great heat of the stove. On the Saturday evening, Madame Lorilleux brought her presents for her godchild, a cup that cost 35 sous, and a christening dress, plaited and trimmed with some cheap lace, which she had got for 6 francs, because it was slightly soiled. On the morrow, Lorilleux, as godfather, gave the mother 6 pounds of sugar. They certainly did things properly. At the baptism supper, which took place at the Coupeaus that evening, they did not come empty-handed. Lorilleux carried a bottle of fine wine under each arm, and his wife brought a large custard pie from a famous pastry shop on Chaussee Clignancourt. But the Lorilleux made sure that the entire neighborhood knew they had spent 20 francs. As soon as Gervaise learned of their gossiping, furious, she stopped giving them credit for generosity. It was at the christening feast that the Coupeaus ended by becoming intimately acquainted with their neighbors on the opposite side of the landing. The other lodging in the little house was occupied by two persons, mother and son, the Goujets, as they were called. Until then, the two families had merely nodded to each other on the stairs and in the street, nothing more. The Coupeaus thought that their neighbors seemed rather bearish. Then, the mother having carried up a pail of water for Gervaise on the morrow of her confinement, the latter had thought it proper to invite them to their feast, more especially as they considered them very respectable people, and naturally they became well acquainted with each other. The Goujets came from the Departement du Nord. The mother mended lace, the son, a blacksmith, worked at an iron bolt factory. They had lived in their lodging for 5 years. Behind the quiet peacefulness of their life, a long-standing sorrow was hidden. Goujet, the father, one day, when furiously drunk at Lille, had beaten a comrade to death with an iron bar, and had afterwards strangled himself in prison with his handkerchief. The widow and child, who had come to Paris after their misfortune, always felt the tragedy hanging over their heads, and atoned for it by a strict honesty and an unvarying gentleness and courage. They had a certain amount of pride in their attitude, and regarded themselves as better than other people. Madame Goujet, dressed in black as usual, her forehead framed in a nun's hood, had a pale, calm, matronly face, as if the whiteness of the lace and the delicate work of her fingers had cast a glow of serenity over her. Goujet was 23 years old, huge, magnificently built, with deep blue eyes and rosy cheeks, and the strength of Hercules. His comrades at the shop called him Golden Mouth because of his handsome blonde beard. Gervaise at once felt a great friendship for these people. When she entered their home for the first time, she was amazed at the cleanliness of the lodging. There was no denying it, one might blow about the place without raising a grain of dust. Oh, and the tiled floor shone like a mirror. Madame Goujet made her enter her son's room just to see it. It was pretty and white like the room of a young girl. An iron bedstead with muslin curtains, a table, a washstand, and a narrow bookcase hanging against the wall. Then there were pictures all over the place, figures cut out, coloured engravings nailed up with 4 tacks, and portraits of all kinds of persons taken from the illustrated papers. Madame Goujet said with a smile that her son was a big baby. He found that reading in the evening put him to sleep, so he amused himself looking at pictures. Gervaise spent an hour with her neighbor without noticing the passing of time. Madame Goujet had gone to sit by the window and work on her lace. Gervaise was fascinated by the hundreds of pins that held the lace, and she felt happy to be there, breathing in the good, clean atmosphere of this home, where such a delicate task enforced a sort of meditative silence. The Goujets were worth visiting. They worked long hours and placed more than a quarter of their fortnight's earnings in the savings bank. In the neighborhood, everyone nodded to them. Everyone talked of their savings. Goujet never had a hole in his clothes, always went out in a clean, short blue blouse without a stain. He was very polite and even a trifle timid, in spite of his broad shoulders. The washerwomen at the end of the street laughed to see him hold down his head when he passed them. He did not like their oaths, and thought it disgusting that women should be constantly uttering foul words. One day, however, he came home tipsy. Then Madame Goujet, for sole reproach, held his father's portrait before him, a daub of a painting hidden away at the bottom of a drawer, and ever since that lesson Goujet never drank more than was good for him, without, however, any hatred of wine, for wine is necessary to the workman. On Sundays he walked out with his mother, who took hold of his arm. He would generally conduct her to Vincennes. At other times they would go to the theatre. His mother remained his passion. He still spoke to her as though he were a little child. Square-headed, his skin toughened by the wielding of the heavy hammer, he somewhat resembled the larger animals, dull of intellect, though good-natured all the same. End of second part of Chapter 4. Recording by David Lazarus.